On November the 22nd, 1963, 50 years ago, he was hardly past his first 1,000 days in office when he was killed by an assassin's bullet as his motorcade wound through Dallas, Texas. He was, of course, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and as well as being the youngest man elected to the office of president, he also achieved the unfortunate milestone of being the youngest to die. I'm joined on the telephone by Eric Bushman, the news reporter for Talk News Radio WBAP in Dallas, Texas. Good evening, Eric. I'm saying good evening.
Good evening.
It's afternoon for you, isn't it?
Good evening to you. Good afternoon here. How is everything in England?
It's fine. A bit cold over here at the moment. What's it like in Texas? What's the weather like?
It was 85 degrees yesterday, if you can believe that.
Oh, yes, I probably can. I know you've done a number of programmes for your station leading up to the anniversary of Kennedy's assassination. Have you been able to speak to anyone who either witnessed what happened or saw the president on his final trip?
Yes, as a matter of fact, later this week, one of the pieces that will air here on WBAP in Dallas features basically a montage of interviews I've done with witnesses who viewed the public execution, if you will, on Elm Street in Dealey Plaza off of downtown Dallas. The closest to the car, not within the motorcade itself, Bill Newman, who you may have heard of. I know that there's a lot of British interest in the assassination, and The Men Who Killed Kennedy, which was a series of productions by Nigel Turner. The Newmans were a big part of that too, and of course he was just about 10 feet away from the president on what is called the fatal shot or the kill shot, the shot that hit the president in the head. He's one of many people that I have talked to and will be broadcasting about in the series that is airing here.
We'll come to the conspiracy theories in a little bit, and the reason I say that is because when I've heard interviews from people who were there on the actual scene, they tend to go with the line that it was a lone gunman and there was no conspiracy. It's only when you tend to speak to people who are a little bit further away from what happened who then come up with conspiracy theories. Has that been how you've found people who you've spoken to who were directly there? They have a different view of what happened than, say, the conspiracy theorists would like us to believe.
Yes, you pretty much nailed it right on the head there. Basically, I mean, even polls as early as the mid-1960s all the way through to today show that basically around 70% of the people in this country, the United States, believe that at least it was much more than just Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone. However, a vast majority of the witnesses, the journalists here in Dallas who were here in 1963, and the investigators, the ones who were actually here and saw it and lived it, a vast majority of them believe Lee Harvey Oswald did it and did it alone.
He was a Democrat. Texas is known as a Republican state. Why did they feel the need to go to Texas anyway? What was the thing happening back in 1963 that made him want to go to Texas? Did he have to go to Texas? He came to Texas for two reasons. Even though his vice president was Lyndon Johnson, who was a former United States senator from Texas, the president knew that Texas was critical to be reelected to the reelection in 1964. So it was a 5-city tour to start in San Antonio and Houston and end in Fort Worth on November 21st. And then the plan was from Fort Worth he would go to Dallas and then Austin on the 22nd. The main reason was the political reason. So he could tour the state, get some attention, looking forward to the 1964 election. The other reason is that there was a huge feud going on within the Democratic Party in Texas between the liberals and the conservatives. And basically the three people that were fighting the most were Vice President Johnson, Governor John Connally, and Senator Ralph Yarborough. So he was also coming to kind of seal that relationship to try to bridge the gaps over the liberal and conservative wing of the Democratic Party in the state. And by all accounts, up until that fateful shot, he was doing well. Jackie was there, which is unusual because she didn't really like that type of event, did she? She didn't like getting involved in the front face of politics. But a lot of, even Republicans, kind of fell for the Kennedy charm. Not that they would vote for them, but they certainly fell for the charm.
That is correct. First of all, to bring up about Jackie, a few months before the Texas trip, they lost an infant son that she had given birth to, Patrick, and she basically she stayed out of the public eye. This was the first time that she really came back into the public eye, and the president was kind of letting her kind of take front stage. He has the famous quote that was made in his final public address in Fort Worth when he said, "A few years ago, I introduced myself in Paris by saying that I was the man who had accompanied Mrs. Kennedy to Paris, and I'm getting that same sensation as I travel around Texas." And of course, the crowd really enjoyed that line. And when you mentioned the Republican Party too, I believe it's believed that a vast majority of the people who were at the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce breakfast the morning of the assassination were actually Republicans. They wanted to come out and see the president because it was so rare that he was in town.
Do the people of Dallas have a deeper connection with his death, do you think, as it sort of happened in their town? It was whilst he was visiting them that he was killed.
Well, I know that the people that lived in Dallas, obviously I wasn't here, nor was I even alive at the time, but the people in Dallas after it happened felt so ashamed, and there was this very unfortunate nickname that went around nationally about the city of Dallas. It was given the nickname the City of Hate. And what had happened is a majority of people from Dallas, if they were to go on vacation, and I'm talking in the 60s and 70s and even into the 80s, they would not say they're from Dallas. They would say they were from Texas, because when they would say things like, "Oh, we're visiting from Dallas," the reception from the other end was, "Oh, well, that's where you kill presidents." So there was a very unfortunate atmosphere toward the city, but that, of course, was changed with some of the mayors afterward. Mayor Eric Johnson, Mayor Wes Wise, who really helped to turn the reputation back to a positive one. And today, this area of the United States is one of the fastest growing in the country.
His greatest achievement has to be, I suppose, his handling of Khrushchev during the missile crisis when the Russians put nuclear weapons in Cuba. It's hard to underestimate how close we came to nuclear war.
Yes, it would be interesting to know what would have happened if Richard Nixon would have won that election, if the same peaceful outcome would have occurred. The president, of course, went kind of against his military advisors, and he sought his own counsel and obviously the counsel of his brother, the Attorney General at the time, Robert Kennedy. And they decided to take a more peaceful action and not go to war. They were very careful also to make sure that when they had to fire warning shots over some of the ships during the blockade of Cuba, that the ships they didn't know that wouldn't mistake it that it was an actual artillery fire. He went above and beyond, I think, what any president would have tried to make sure for peace. That's what he wanted, was peace. And that's what he was aiming for in one of his final speeches in June of 1963 when he started talking about and trying to sell the test ban treaty with the Soviet Union. He wanted peace, and I think that's pretty much the vast majority of President Kennedy's legacy.
Yeah, and it was done in typical Kennedy style, as we found out later, which was he was publicly quite strong with the Russians, but privately he sent Bobby off to come to a deal over rocket, because the Russians had said they want all American rockets out of Turkey. Publicly they said no, but privately he sent Bobby to agree to it.
Yeah, and I think that also leads to the mystery of his legacy. What was he really thinking? Is that really what he wanted? And of course, as you mentioned, Bobby, Bobby was pretty much the right-hand man to the president. And of course, no one really took the assassination of John Kennedy harder than his brother, Bobby.
Yeah. Kennedy was an icon of that period, as was Jackie. And of that generation, you think back to the Rat Pack, Marilyn Monroe, James Dean. They don't make film stars like them anymore, and they don't seem to make presidents like Kennedy.
I would agree with that. I would also say that the assassination itself helped preserve Kennedy's legacy. If you look at the history in modern times, when we look at the presidents since Kennedy who have served 2 terms, there's always something that happens in that second term that kind of becomes the unfortunate thing that we'll remember. First of all, with Reagan, you had the Iran-Contra scandal. With Clinton, you had the Monica Lewinsky situation. Look at what's going on with Obamacare, with President Obama right now, and with Nixon, he resigned. Kennedy did not have a chance to have a second term. I think he would have won in 64. Many historians will say he most likely would have won in 64. So what would have happened with the Vietnam War? Probably not what happened under Johnson and Nixon. So it would be very interesting what Kennedy's legacy, would we remember him so well if he would have lived?
Going back to the conspiracy theories, most Americans surveyed nowadays seem to believe that the government covered up the killings. I mean, what do you think? Do you think there is any conspiracy theories that are worth listening to? Any conspiracy theorists? You've done a lot of work on Kennedy for this particular week. Have you found something that has made you sort of think, well, it doesn't sound quite right?
Well, I think there are a lot of things out there where you need to question, and I think that the Kennedy assassination definitely is kind of started that whole process with the way people looked at the United States government here in the United States. Obviously, Watergate being the icing on that cake, but I think that it's important to question. I think it's important to investigate. That's what we as journalists do. I think there are a lot of people such as Robert Groden, Mark Lane, those types of individuals who have raised a lot of questions. Now, some of their conclusions are very controversial, but that's also been a very important part of this story. But personally, I usually don't share my personal opinion because as soon as I do, I lose half my sources. So, but I think it is important to question things because people simply don't want to believe that someone as inconsequential as Lee Harvey Oswald was able, with luck and a rifle and a hiding spot, to be able to take out someone as consequential as John F. Kennedy.
Well, listen, thank you very much for joining us, Eric. If anyone wanted to hear your John F. Kennedy series, it's broadcasting on WBAP. Can you listen online as well? Is there any way to listen again?
Yes, you absolutely can. I'm not sure how long. I'm sure for a few weeks it will be up afterwards. The individual segments are being put on our website, and I'll give that to you real quick. It's www.wbap.com/JFK50. So again, that's wbap.com/JFK50, and all of last week's pieces are up there. This week's pieces will be put up as they air, and then there's a lot of long-form, raw interviews that I've done over the past few years that we've included on there for people to take in.
Final question, just quickly. You've for this particular series that you've been doing, have you found anything out that you didn't know before? Is there anything left to find out about the assassination of John F. Kennedy, or has it all been done now?
I think one of the interesting things that I found out, not so much about the assassination itself, but about the Texas trip. There is a new documentary I happened to watch over the weekend that was put on by National Geographic Channel in the United States that talked about the entire Texas trip as a whole. And it basically started in San Antonio and it went all the way up to the assassination and kind of left the assassination out. And you really get to see intimate moments between the president and the first lady that you haven't seen before, and interviews with the Secret Service officers to talk about the trip and to talk about, out of all presidential trips, how successful and welcomed they were in such a red Republican state, and how successful the trip would have been had the assassination not occurred.
Eric Bushman from WBAP, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
My pleasure.
Jason McCrossan. SFM.